Hello and greetings from the Netherlands. A warm thank you to James Hatch and his team for organising this online event in the context of the Alliance for International Education. It's an honour to be here to talk to you today. As I was preparing this talk, I sought some advice from a young first-year IB diploma student whose name is Hannah. And I asked Hannah, what do you think your teachers need to know? I have the opportunity, I said, to be speaking to a number of IB teachers, heads of school, researchers, people who are interested in what happens in our world. What do you think it's important from your perspective for them to know? And she thought for a moment. She said, I think it's really important for our teachers to know how to help us talk to each other. I nodded and paused, and she continued, I think it's really important that we learn how to have our own conversations, but where we're not only thinking about winning the argument, but listening to each other. Whew, I thought, that's a tall order, one that we all need help with, it seems, today from where I'm standing. Peter Coleman has been working at Columbia University for the last 15 years with the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict and Complexity. Coleman and his colleagues conduct research on polarizing moral conflicts, and one of the tools they use to do this is the Difficult Conversations Lab. I like the sound of that lab. I'm wondering if any of you think that your offices are actually difficult conversations labs sometimes. Research conducted through the lab looks at whether and how dialogue can succeed as a tool for reducing tensions between opponents on highly polarized issues. In the lab, people who have been identified as having different views on divisive issues speak together, and the researchers observe the participants as they talk, monitoring their cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and physiological experiences over the course of the conversation. Now, one thing researchers identified were types of behaviors that they distinguished as ProSelf, where personal goals dominate above all else, and ProSocial, where concerns for others and the self dominate. And it's probably not surprising that they found that pro-social motives in the participants tended to foster constructive conflict processes and outcomes, but perhaps a more interesting outcome was determining whether there were any contributing factors that might impact the participants' behaviors and attitudes in the course of the conversation. They did find that once the conversation starts off with mainly pro-self motivated behaviors, individuals will return to this behavior, and with each new instance of pro-self motivated behavior, there is a smaller and smaller likelihood that an individual will switch to pro-social motivated behaviors in the course of the conversation, which in turn leads to a higher probability for intractable conflict. The reverse is true too. Participants starting off with pro-social motivated behaviors are more likely to show these behaviors again. So the good news is that when it starts out well, it can get even better. And the other good news is that if we observe pro-self behavior at the start, we know we need to reframe the way the conflict is being addressed very quickly. That is to say, in pro-social terms, if we want to make any progress whatsoever. Another finding of the Difficult Conversations Lab is that how topics are framed and presented to participants makes a difference to how the conversations go. That is to say, more nuanced and complex presentations of the problem, instead of pro versus con statements, led to significant differences in terms of individuals' openness, learning, and satisfaction with the encounters. The way the sessions were structured and facilitated was also a factor, where encouraging defense of a position versus exploration and accuracy of understanding resulted in differing levels of consensus finding. Some of these things I think we as teachers know intuitively or based on our practice. Another of the basic findings from the Difficult Conversations Lab is that the more complexity in one's life correlates to the tendency to be more tolerant. And I think that sounds logical too, and underpins much of our thinking around international education, where diversity within a community is seen to promote opportunities for exchange, discussion, growth, and empathy. This is embodied, for example, in the part of the IBO's mission statement that reads that those who are different from us may also be right. But Coleman tells another story that I think we can recognize as well, and that equally requires a response in the context of education. Coleman and his colleagues were called in to examine and offer some help in an explosive situation in a school community in the South Bronx in New York City. Coleman talks about the fact that his team interviewed all sorts of people in the school and in the community to gain an understanding of what was going on. And they found out that the school had become the site of violent exchanges between opposing gangs, that the police were involved. The principal was desperate. The teachers and parents were frightened. What also became evident to the researchers were for those who were involved in the conflict, but looking on from the outside, the parents, the teachers, the principal, the local pastor who had been called in, the counselor, the problem was described as being very complex. But for the people involved on the inside, the adolescents in this case, the problem was very simple. The problem was them, the other guys. There was nothing complex about it. And this is another feature of conflict that Coleman, among others, recognizes. While we know that viewing situations as complex and nuanced can lead to more consensus building, potentially to defining areas of overlap and common ground, there are strong psychological drivers that push us to view the others, those guys over there, as the problem. We know this in-group, out-group bias emerges quickly, merely by identifying or being identified as a member of one group and not another group, as research in the field of social identity theory has shown us over the past half a century. So based on what I've been saying up until now, a sentence such as this could be generated. Complex conflicts appear simpler, seen from the inside. It's not only the work of social psychologists such as Tajfel and Turner that illustrate to us that when we're in a situation that activates our group identity over our personal identity, we appear to have a psychological tendency to view problems through the lens of our own group first, and in doing so, veer towards something simpler. There appear to be other mechanisms at work that push our thinking towards simplicity. Daniel Kahneman, in his international bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow, brought dual system theory from the field of cognitive psychology into our daily parlance. Kahneman, as well as Stanovich, have described two types of thinking to help us to envision them: System 1 and System 2. Sloman has referred to associative versus rule-based thinking, and later, intuitive thinking versus deliberative thinking. And Kahneman spends a lot of time describing System 1, the thinking fast system, the quick, automatic, associative, and affective-based form of thinking, primarily because of its influence on the way we act and make decisions, which is often underestimated and unseen. It's automatic, often relying on unconscious processes, and of particular interest, I think, for the point I wish to make here, is not very good at thinking about many things at once. Kahneman takes thinking statistically as his primary example. That is, he identifies numerous occasions when our responses to questions are not based on statistical information, which we may indeed have access to, but instead on what our mind can most easily reach for, which often corresponds to what is most recent or most impactful in intensity. He gives a simple example of this, which as a Scrabble player, illustrates this tendency for me. When asked to consider the letter K in the English language and whether it is more likely to appear as the first letter in a word or the third letter in a word, people exaggerated the frequency of the letter K appearing in the first position. because it's easier to come up with words that begin with a letter than to come up with words with a letter in the third position. We remember those words more easily, and this ease of memory, which Kahneman and his colleague Tversky called the availability heuristic, leads us to beliefs that are based less on fact, measurable instances, or statistics, and more on what we remember in the moment of being asked. So we appear to have different sources of evidence that suggest that we tend towards simplification and towards speed when seeking to make sense of our world. Clearly, the good news is that automation of a system can leave more room for engagement with other types of complexity. We see this, for example, in learning to read, where the goal is to automate the letter-by-letter decoding that is required to translate marks written on a page or a screen into meaning without passing through the phonetic sounding out that generally characterizes early reading. By automating this process, we have more cognitive space to engage with the meaning of what is written rather than the letters or signs that transmit that meaning. But how and when do we move away from cognitive ease towards the type of complexity that might lead to the types of conversations that Hannah defined earlier? How do we develop the skills of consensus making over just arguing to win? Some of you may be familiar with James Nottingham and his work. His 2017 book, The Learning Challenge: How to Guide Your Students Through the Learning Pit to Achieve Deeper Understanding, is pictured here. I particularly like this cover photo because I think that we understand the idea of the precarious path and the goal of the gorgeous mountains in the distance, the desirable end point. But actually, Nottingham says that we have to go through a pit before we get to those mountains, which I wonder is what lies on the other side of the precipice. Perhaps the editors couldn't really decide on an appropriate photo of a pit, or being in a pit, or looking up from a pit, and decided to leave a little metaphorical wiggle room for us to imagine what this pit feels like. But the point I wish to take from Nottingham's work is his understanding that being in the learning pit is necessary. The pit, of course, is a metaphor for stepping out of the comfort zone to explore ideas or contradictions that are complex and perplexing, he writes. It's a mental state or a mental space where people are in a state of cognitive conflict, where you have many ideas that make sense, each on their own, but when juxtaposed, appear to conflict with each other. The pit represents having multiple ideas that haven't been sorted yet. You are not in the pit if you have no ideas. And you work your way out of the pit by doing the difficult and uncomfortable work of moving from separate concepts to identifying contradictions, examining options, trying to form meaning, connecting, and explaining. Nottingham provides some school-age example statements to illustrate what is meant by cognitive conflict. For example, he and his students have worked on the idea that stealing is wrong, but Robin Hood did the right thing. In some ways, I think Coleman's Difficult Conversations Lab is a sort of lab pit. However, in the lab, the separate concepts are embodied in two people rather than in one person's mind. And as long as those concepts remain separate in the minds of the two people rather than multiple concepts in one mind, we risk simplified thinking and social polarization. Many theorists have recognized the place that cognitive conflict has in our growth. Piaget called this disequilibrium, a state of discomfort that comes when things are no longer fitting together nicely, where something new comes along and doesn't fit in. Debra Williams-Gualandi developed the concept of difficult knowledge from the field of psychoanalysis to describe the inner impact of knowledge being presented to the individual that may conflict with personal or cultural truths, with what one knows, and potentially with what one thinks one is. So one is faced with the possibility of expansion and growth, but equally with rigidity and potentially trauma. So what Nottingham, Piaget, and Britzman to take as examples, imply is that complexity is uncomfortable and destabilizing. What then are the implications of this for our work in education and Hannah's request that teachers teach young people how to have their own conversations? I recently conducted some research in relation to teacher beliefs about the intersection of the development of intercultural understanding and identity. At the time, I was interested in hearing experienced teachers talk about themselves and their work, teachers who have been working in the field for a number of years in a number of different international schools. The premise was that these teachers would have their own experience to draw on as professionals and in personal ways as well. A number of points emerged from the conversations I had with these committed and thoughtful professionals, but one in particular relates to Hannah's request. Many, not all, but many of the teachers I spoke with voiced a real aversion to engaging with identity issues in the classroom, or thought their international schools were not doing a good job of engaging with difficult issues in general. I'm not referring here to what we might call personal identity issues, or identity issues lived and expressed as personal, because clearly the social framework is always at work when we refer to concepts as old as the third culture kid, culture shock, or the more recently implemented concept of intersectionality as tools to understand the often problematic lived experience of the layering of different identities within the individual. What teachers voiced was a sense that engaging with topics that drew more overtly on belief systems, values, priorities, religious beliefs, or political stances became identity issues in the classroom. And this was risky. This was rocky, slippery, mine-filled terrain. That is not to say that this is the case for everyone. We all know, perhaps many of you are actively involved in the classroom or in clubs or extracurricular activities that you do, where you do just this, create a forum where engagement with these topics is at the center of your work. But the fact that some teachers who would otherwise identify themselves as having a high level of intercultural understanding shied away from this engagement got me thinking. I saw a paradox in part of our professional knowledge base that recognizes that it is in the borderlands, as Alan has said, in the crossing of frontiers, which Hayden and Thompson write about, in the areas of discomfort that real learning happens. And at the same time, there was a palpable discomfort with the idea of discomfort that teachers held. If we acknowledge then that complex conflicts appear simpler when seen from the inside, and that engaging with complexity is not fast, not automatic, and our system one way of thinking provides us with cognitively easy responses without even having us ask for them, and the complexity is uncomfortable and destabilizing, it's not surprising that we might find engaging with complexity difficult intellectually, but also emotionally. We as teachers and educators have been taught that good classroom management includes ways of talking, exchanging ideas, presenting information, and disagreeing. We expect our classrooms to be places of respect. We're encouraged to see our classrooms as safe spaces, our relationships with students as safe spaces. And it may be that inviting thorny issues into the classroom would threaten those norms which are deeply rooted in the way we think about good teaching. That assumption is based on another assumption or intuition, which is that certain topics are so emotionally fraught that the rules of good conduct may be laid aside. Perhaps the teachers I spoke to didn't feel informed enough about the topics, did not feel they had enough practice as mediators of disagreement or conflict, that their discomfort was rooted in the feeling of not being properly prepared to manage a situation that required some balance between freedom of expression and protecting the rights of others to not feel threatened, belittled, or harmed by the words and thoughts of others. Just for a moment, I'd like to describe a classroom, a school where more than 50 languages are spoken. In one classroom in that school, students from more than 15 different home countries have met, as they do each week, to improve their English language skills. The teacher, Miss Clancy, is using poetry. She's using Carol Ann Duffy's poem originally, which some of you may be familiar with, to work on vocabulary, and in particular on line breaks in the poetry. And students are trying to work out how line breaks emphasize certain words, certain ideas. It's the end of class, and Miss Clancy is leaning over to look at what one of her students, a particularly silent young woman who hasn't spoken, who never speaks, has been writing. And she reads this poem. Priya, the young woman who is the author of this poem, migrated from Bangladesh with her family when she was 6. Her family migrated to the UK, and Miss Clancy is a real teacher in a real school in the UK. And she saw the space that poetry created for this young woman. And she began, because of that observation and experience, she began what was known among her colleagues as the Very Quiet Foreign Girls Poetry Group, where the silence of loss found voice. Imagine another school. A school where children and adolescents are creatively exploring life experiences while connecting with positive adult role models. Through initiatives such as Artolution, young people contribute to their communities by making colorful, uplifting murals with messages of hope in some of the bleakest environments on Earth. These are different types of international schools. And these projects are grounded in the principle of multivoicedness. Multivoicedness is a concept that can be traced back to the Russian linguist Bakhtin, who wrote in the early 20th century. And Bakhtin's use of this concept, which is also translated with the word heteroglossia, was to point to instances of language use that broke through or made cracks in the singular authoritarian discourse of the day, of any day. And he described this multivoicedness as a fluid, moving, never settled state of affairs. And beyond the point of framing conversations in education, which I'm making, I think Bakhtin's ideas provide a useful lens with which we can think about the struggles we encounter in many areas today, where issues of power and powerlessness come to the fore. One very recent example was brought to my attention in an interview recently published in The Guardian. The historian Olivette Otele was discussing her recently published book entitled African Europeans, An Untold Story, where she gives voice to people whose stories have been overlooked because, as she explains in the interview, we only want to present stories that are easy to understand, stories that put people of African descent in boxes. When stories are easy to understand, they are easy to control. Anu Tabanath, in her recent book Beyond Guilt Trips, says that the delicate balancing act of holding on to conflicting thoughts and feelings requires practice and skill. Taranath argues that our lack of such skills hinders our interpretation of emotions and our ability to give voice to experiences. One of the main points of her book is the fact that building critical thinking through education opens students' eyes to the heavy weight of new knowledge. She proposes an inclusive framework for thought that the seemingly simple word "and" allows. And she encourages us to embrace the complexity of "and." An open conversation navigates between honesty and discomfort. We need to be critical and compassionate in thinking about our service learning. Our unexamined thought processes can be comforting and narrow-minded. So, a few thoughts for Hannah's teachers. Complexity comes from ensuring we have multivoicedness. How we frame our discussions turns them into debates or dialogues. We plant those seeds at a very young age. If our engagement with cognitive complexity is translated into a pro or con, winner takes all endeavor, we create one set of emotional associations in our students about how engaging with complexity feels. If we do that often enough, system one, the associative, fast thinking, takes over, and complexity feels like a debate. If instead we frame the engagement as creative endeavor with many entry points, where co-creation and consensus building in the midst of multiple points of view, multiple voices exists, perhaps we get closer to teaching our students how to have conversations with each other, where one only gets the prize when everyone wins. Thank you.